My hands were still shaking when I signed the transfer document, and I want you to understand something before I tell you anything else. I have not shaken like that since 1987, the year I buried my husband and drove myself home from the funeral home because there was nobody left to drive me. You're too old to understand business, Mom. That is what my son said to me, in front of 11 people, at a conference table I had personally paid for, in a building I had personally financed, 22 years ago, back when he was still small enough to sit on my lap while I did the books at the kitchen table with a calculator and a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour before I noticed. I did not raise my voice. I did not correct him in front of the room. I picked up my folder, thanked everyone for their time, and walked out of that meeting like I had somewhere important to be. I did. I had a phone call to make. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, my son believed he ran that company. By 4 o'clock the following Monday, he was going to learn that he never had. I had absolutely no idea, sitting in that parking lot with my hands still trembling on the steering wheel, that within 11 days I would be sitting across from him at a table with a lawyer, an auditor, and a folder 3 inches thick, and that he would be the one whose hands were shaking by the end of it. My name is Diane Whitfield. I am 60 years old. I live on 11 acres just outside Prescott, Arizona, in a farmhouse-style home I built with my own 2 hands, not literally, though I did learn to hang drywall the hard way in my 40s, and a company I built from a card table in my garage into something that, as of this year, moves $9 million a year in specialty industrial hardware across 4 states. My son's name is Bradley. He is 34 years old. And until 11 days before I am telling you this story, he believed, with total sincerity, that I was a relic. A liability. A well-meaning old woman who had gotten lucky once, 30 years ago, and had been coasting on that luck ever since while he did the real work. I want to tell you how a 60-year-old woman with reading glasses on a chain around her neck and a coffee stain on the cuff of her blazer ended up firing her own son from the company she built, and why, if you are watching this tonight because someone in your own life has made you feel too old, too slow, too out of touch to matter, I think you need to hear every part of what happened before you decide what happens next in your own story. Let me start at the beginning. Because the beginning matters more than people think. I grew up in a double-wide trailer outside Kingman, Arizona, the second of 4 kids, with a father who worked the copper mines until his lungs gave out and a mother who cleaned houses on the west side of town for families who called her by her first name and expected her to call them Mrs. Somebody. I was 17 when I married my husband, Ray, in a courthouse with borrowed shoes because mine had a hole in the sole I didn't want anyone to see. I was 26 when Ray died on a job site, a scaffolding accident, 11 stories up, over in Phoenix, and I found out I was a widow the way most women find out, which is a police officer standing on your porch at 6:40 in the morning, hat in his hands, not quite able to look you in the eye. I had 2 things when Ray died. I had a 4-year-old son named Bradley, asleep in the next room. And I had $4,300 in a savings account that Ray and I had been building toward a down payment on a real house, not a rental. I did not spend that money on grief. I spent it on a used pickup truck, a stack of catalogs from a specialty fastener distributor in Ohio, and a folding table I set up in my garage. I started selling industrial hardware, bolts, fasteners, specialty brackets, to small machine shops and contractors around northern Arizona who were tired of waiting 3 weeks for orders from the big national suppliers. I drove that truck myself. I loaded it myself. I learned to read a torque specification chart at my kitchen table at midnight after Bradley was asleep, with a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour before I noticed, because that was the only quiet time I had. That is the woman my son grew up watching. Calluses on her hands from loading pallets. A voice that never rose above steady, even when the bank called about a missed payment, even when a supplier tried to shortchange her because she was just a young mother with a truck. I built Whitfield Industrial Supply one account at a time, one relationship at a time, for 34 years. By the time Bradley was in high school, we had a real warehouse. By the time he graduated college, business degree, State University, paid for in full with company money, no loans, because I had promised myself he would never start his adult life the way I started mine. We had 4 locations and a logistics contract with 2 regional manufacturers that most of our competitors would have given a great deal to have. I want to tell you about one particular year, because I think it explains something about the woman I became that no amount of summary can. It was 1994. Bradley was 11. We had just lost our second largest account, a machine shop in Flagstaff that got bought out by a national chain who brought their own supplier with them, and for about 6 weeks that spring, I genuinely did not know if we were going to make payroll for our 4 employees. I remember sitting at that kitchen table at 11 o'clock at night, the same table, with a legal pad and a calculator, moving numbers from column to column like I could rearrange reality if I just found the right order to put them in. I remember the specific sound the refrigerator made when it cycled on, an old hum that used to fill the silence of that kitchen, and how I came to almost welcome that hum because it meant I wasn't sitting in complete silence with my fear. I did not tell Bradley how close we came to losing everything that spring. I made him pancakes on Saturday mornings the same as always, and I drove that same truck to work every day with the same posture, because a child should not have to carry his mother's fear on top of his own. We made payroll. Barely. By July I had signed 2 new accounts, one of them a small aerospace parts supplier out of Chandler that, 20 years later, would become one of the 4 pillars of everything we built. I tell you this because I want you to understand that competence is not a personality trait you're born with. It is built, quietly, in kitchens at 11 at night, by people nobody is watching and nobody is thanking, and it does not evaporate the day you turn 60. If anything, it compounds, the way interest compounds, until it becomes something a much younger person mistakes for luck because they never saw the version of you sitting at that table with the calculator and the cold coffee, praying the numbers would move. There is another memory from those years I want to share with you, because it sets up something important about who Bradley became. When he was 13, I brought him to the warehouse on a Saturday to help with inventory, and partway through the afternoon, a driver from one of our suppliers made a comment, not cruel exactly, more careless, about how it must be nice for Bradley to inherit a business without having to build one. I remember Bradley's face, 13 years old, going a little red, and I remember pulling him aside afterward, not to comfort him, but to tell him something I believed completely at the time and still believe now, that inheriting something and understanding something are 2 entirely different accomplishments, and that the second one is the only one that actually matters in the long run. I thought, at the time, that I had taught him that lesson. I know now that a lesson taught once, at 13, does not automatically survive 21 years of being handed things he did not have to bleed for the way I bled for them. I want you to sit with that detail for a moment, because it matters for everything that comes after. Everything Bradley had, his education, his salary, his title, the leather chair he sat in at that conference table the day he told me I was too old to understand business, every bit of it came from a woman he had just spent the last 2 years quietly deciding was expendable. Ray had been gone 34 years by the time this story starts. I want to tell you something about being alone that long, something I don't think people who have always had a partner beside them fully understand. You get used to a particular kind of silence. Not sad, exactly. Just companionable, in its own way, after enough years. I still made coffee for 2 most mornings out of habit and poured the second cup down the drain. I still slept on my side of the bed, 34 years later, like Ray might come back from a job site and need his side. I am telling you this so you understand that the company was not just a company to me. It was the only child of my labor besides Bradley himself. It was what I built instead of remarrying, instead of leaning on anyone, instead of ever once in 3.5 decades letting myself be as small and as breakable as that 26-year-old widow standing in her kitchen doorway looking at a police officer's hat. Bradley came into the business 12 years ago, right out of college, and I gave him every advantage I had never had. I started him in the warehouse. Yes, I wasn't going to hand him an office on day 1, but within 18 months he was running procurement. Within 4 years he was VP of operations. 2 years ago, I made him president of the company, kept the title of CEO and majority ownership for myself, and told him, in front of our whole leadership team, that I trusted him with the daily running of everything I had built. That was my first mistake. Not because he wasn't capable. He is capable. Bradley is smart, and he works hard, and in a different family, with a different mother, none of what I am about to tell you would have happened. But somewhere in those 2 years, my son stopped seeing me as the founder of the company and started seeing me as an obstacle standing between him and the version of himself he wanted to become. The first signal, and I want to be honest with you, because I did notice it, I just didn't let myself believe it, came about 8 months ago. We were in a vendor negotiation, a big one, a potential contract with a manufacturer down in Tucson that would have doubled our southern Arizona volume. Bradley was leading the meeting. I was there in a supporting role, which was normal by then. I had been stepping back on purpose, letting him build his own credibility with our partners. At one point, the vendor's rep, a man about my age, addressed a pricing question directly to me, force of habit, I think, since my name is still on the building. Bradley answered for me. Not incorrectly. Just, over me. Fast, smooth, before I had even opened my mouth, like he was intercepting the ball before I could fumble it. I remember the vendor's eyes flicking to me, just for a second, checking whether that had bothered me. I smiled and let it go. I told myself he was just eager. I told myself a lot of things over those 8 months that I no longer believe. The second signal was smaller and, in hindsight, worse. Bradley started leaving his phone face down on the conference table during our Monday leadership meetings. Not unusual on its own, everybody does that now. But he started angling it toward himself when I walked into a room. A small thing. The kind of thing you'd miss completely unless you'd spent 34 years learning to read a room full of men who didn't think a young widow belonged in it. I know what it looks like when someone doesn't want you to see something. I have known that look since I was 26 years old. There was a third signal, too, one I did not fully understand the significance of until much later, and I want to include it because I think it's the kind of detail that will feel familiar to anyone who has ever sensed a shift in a relationship long before they had proof of it. Bradley started referring to the company differently in casual conversation. For years, he had said, our company, or, more often, Mom's company, in a way that was maybe a little diminishing but at least honest about where things stood. Somewhere in that 8-month window, without my noticing exactly when it happened, he started saying, the company, no possessive at all, a strange kind of grammatical distance, as though he were already speaking about it the way an outside consultant might, someone hired to optimize an asset rather than someone raised inside it. I remember the first time I noticed it clearly. We were at a family dinner, just the two of us, at a steakhouse in town he'd chosen, and he said, the company really needs to modernize its ownership structure if it wants to survive the next decade. Not we. Not Mom's company. Just the company, like it was a stranger's business he had been consulting on and had strong, disinterested opinions about. I remember setting down my fork and feeling something small and cold move through my chest, and then telling myself I was reading too much into a turn of phrase. I have thought about that dinner many times since, turning that one sentence over like a stone I keep finding in my pocket, and I no longer think I was reading too much into it at all. I also want to mention Bradley's wife, Ashley, briefly, because she plays a smaller role in this story than you might expect, and I think that absence is its own kind of detail worth naming. Ashley is a kind woman, genuinely, and in the months leading up to everything I'm about to tell you, she grew noticeably quieter around me at family gatherings, not cold, just careful, the way people get careful when they know something they haven't decided whether to say out loud. I did not press her. I did not want to put her in the position of choosing between loyalty to her husband and honesty with her mother-in-law. But I noticed it, the same way I noticed the phone angled away from me and the missing possessive pronoun, and I filed it away with everything else, because by then I had learned that the things people don't say are often louder than the things they do. The explicit moment, the one that finally made the signals impossible to ignore, happened on a Tuesday. I remember it was a Tuesday because Tuesdays are when we do our full leadership review, all 11 senior staff around the big table in the conference room I had built with a home equity loan back in 2003, back when Bradley was still in middle school and thought I hung the moon. We were discussing a proposal to bring on outside investors, private equity, specifically, a firm out of Scottsdale that had been circling us for over a year, sensing correctly that we were profitable, growing, and a little bit vulnerable in the way that any founder-led company eventually becomes vulnerable. Bradley had been quietly meeting with them. I found that out in that meeting, in front of everyone, because he presented it as though it were already decided. I asked a simple question. I asked what percentage of equity they were proposing to take, and what protections would exist for minority shareholders after the deal, because I had read enough term sheets in my life to know that growth capital is sometimes just a polite phrase for, we are going to own your company in 5 years and you are going to work for us in your own building. Bradley sighed. Not a small sigh. A performance of a sigh, for the room. And he said, Mom, I really think this is a little more complicated than what you're used to. You built something incredible, genuinely, but the market's different now. Structures are different now. You're too old to understand business the way it works today. Let me and the team handle this one. 11 people sat at that table. I watched 3 of them look down at their notepads. I watched one of them, our CFO, a woman named Priya who had been with me for 9 years, go very still in a way that told me she was as uncomfortable as I was. I did not raise my voice. I want to say that again because I think it matters, and I think it is the difference between what happened next and what could have happened next if I had let 26-year-old Diane, the one standing in the doorway with the police officer's hat, come roaring back up out of the ground where I'd buried her 34 years ago. I closed my folder. I said, that's a fair perspective, Bradley. Let's revisit it, in a voice as even as a kitchen counter. And then I thanked the room, and I walked out, and I got into my truck. I still drive a truck, the same make and model Ray and I bought the year before he died, though a much newer one now, and I sat in the parking lot with my hands shaking on the wheel for exactly 4 minutes before I picked up my phone. Something had settled into my chest sitting in that truck. Not anger, exactly, though there was anger somewhere underneath it. It was heavier than anger. It felt like furniture being moved into a room in my own chest that I had not agreed to have furnished. My hands went cold, actually cold, despite it being 91 degrees outside in a Prescott June. I remember thinking, with a strange, clear detachment, he has been having private conversations with a private equity firm about my company for at least a year, and he has just called me too old to be told about it in a room I built. I did not call a lawyer first. I called Priya. Priya Nair had been my chief financial officer for 9 years. She had come to me from a bigger company, tired of being talked over by men half as competent and twice as loud as she was, and I had given her real authority the day I hired her, because I remembered exactly what it felt like to sit in a room and have someone assume you didn't understand your own numbers. She picked up on the second ring. I need everything, I told her. Every meeting Bradley has had with Hallbrook Capital in the last 18 months. Every email. Every calendar invite. I want to know what he's told them, and I want to know what he's offered them, and I want to know before Monday. There was a pause on the line, long enough that I could hear her deciding something. Then she said, Diane, I've been waiting for you to ask me that for about 4 months. That was the first time my hands went properly cold. Not from the 91-degree Arizona heat. From the realization that my own CFO, a woman I trusted completely, a woman who owed her career trajectory to me, had been sitting on information for 4 months, waiting to see whether I would notice on my own, because she wasn't sure whose side I would land on if it came down to my son. I told her I understood why she'd waited. I meant it. I would have waited too, in her position. And then I asked her to send me everything by end of day Thursday, and I drove home, and I made myself a cup of coffee, and I did not cry, because I promised myself 34 years ago that I would save my crying for things worth crying about, and I did not yet know if this was going to be one of those things. It was Thursday night, at exactly 9:52 p.m., sitting at my kitchen table, the same table, if I'm honest, though refinished twice since 1991, that I opened the folder Priya had sent me and found out exactly how far my son had gone. I want to describe this to you the way it actually happened, because I think the details matter. The folder was labeled, simply, Holbrook, BW Correspondence. 41 pages. I made a fresh pot of coffee before I opened it, because some part of me already knew I would need the whole pot. The first email was from 14 months earlier. Bradley, from his personal account, not his work account. That detail alone told me everything I needed to know about whether he believed what he was doing was above board, reaching out to a managing partner at Holbrook Capital named Dennis Farrow, introducing himself as president of Whitfield Industrial Supply, soon to be the primary decision-maker in an ownership transition. Soon to be. 14 months ago. I had made no plans, discussed no timeline, signed nothing, even hinted at nothing, regarding stepping back from majority ownership. My son had told a private equity firm that I was on my way out before I myself knew it. The second document that stopped me cold, and this is the one where I want to tell you my hands actually did go cold, in July, in a house with the air conditioning set to 72, was an internal memo Bradley had sent to Farrow, apparently in response to a due diligence question about founder risk. I am going to tell you what it said as close to word for word as I can remember, because I have read it more times now than I can count, and some sentences do not leave you once they've arrived. Bradley had written, "My mother built this company and I respect that enormously, but she's 60 now and increasingly resistant to modern deal structures. She still signs off on major decisions, which I know will be a concern for you. I'm confident I can manage her expectations and, if needed, manage her out of active decision-making within 12 to 18 months without disrupting operations or triggering her emotional attachment to the business in a way that becomes a liability. Manage her out. Manage her expectations. Emotional attachment, as though building something from a card table and a widow's severance check for 34 years was a character flaw instead of the only reason any of these men in suits had a company worth circling in the first place. I read that sentence twice. Then I read it a third time, out loud, alone, at my kitchen table, at 10:14 p.m., just to hear how it sounded in a human voice instead of on a page, because sometimes a thing does not become fully real until you say it into the empty air of your own kitchen. I kept reading, even though every instinct I had was telling me to close the folder and go to bed and pretend I would deal with it tomorrow with a clearer head. There were 17 more pages after that memo, and I want to walk you through a few more of them, because the shape of a betrayal is rarely contained in a single sentence, it's contained in the accumulation, the way water finds its way through a foundation not through one dramatic crack but through 100 small ones you didn't think to seal. There was a spreadsheet, attached to an email from 3 months earlier, titled simply, Transition Timeline, Draft. It laid out, in Bradley's handwriting converted to a clean digital table, a month-by-month plan for what he called operational consolidation, which, translated out of the careful language of business, meant a plan to gradually shift decision-making authority away from me across every department, starting with procurement, which he already controlled, and ending, 18 months out, with what the spreadsheet labeled, in a cell I stared at for a long time, Founder Emeritus Transition. Ceremonial role only. Ceremonial. 34 years, reduced to a cell in a spreadsheet with the word ceremonial typed into it by a boy I had rocked to sleep in a rocking chair I still own, still keep in the corner of my bedroom, because I could never quite bring myself to give it away. There was also a text message thread, screenshotted and forwarded to Farrow at Holbrook as part of what Bradley apparently intended as evidence of team alignment. In it, Bradley had written to our head of logistics, a young man named Casey who I had personally promoted twice, "Once the deal closes we'll finally be able to run this thing the way it should have been run for the last 10 years without her looking over everyone's shoulder." Casey's reply, which I read with a strange, hollow kind of surprise, was simply, "Careful, man. She's sharper than you think." I sat with that reply for a long time. Even the people my son was trying to recruit into his plan were quietly warning him not to underestimate me. He had not listened to them either. By the time I finished the full folder, it was past midnight. I remember looking at the clock on my stove, 12:07 a.m., and thinking, with a strange, exhausted clarity, that I had spent the entire day performing normalcy for a man who had already spent 14 months planning my ceremonial erasure from my own life's work. I did not sleep much that night. I lay in bed on my side, Ray's side still empty beside me the way it had been for 34 years, and I listened to the house settle the way old houses do, small ticks and creaks in the dark, and I thought about the word ceremonial until the sky outside my window started to turn gray. I did not cry that night either. I want to be honest with you about why. It was not because I am made of stone. It was because underneath the hurt, and there was real hurt, the kind that lives specifically in the body of a mother, not the CEO, there was something else moving in alongside it, something colder and steadier, and I recognized it immediately because I had felt it exactly once before in my life, standing in a doorway at 6:40 in the morning 34 years earlier. It was the feeling of a woman deciding, quietly and completely, that she was not going to be managed by anyone. I did not confront Bradley that week. This is the part where I think a lot of people, watching this, might have done something different, and I want to explain my reasoning, because I think it's the most important decision in this entire story. If I had confronted him Friday morning, furious, hurt, demanding an explanation, here is exactly what would have happened. He would have apologized. He would have meant it, in the moment, the way people always mean an apology delivered under pressure with real consequences suddenly visible on the horizon. And then, because he still had access to systems, to relationships, to 18 months of groundwork with Hallbrook Capital that I did not yet fully understand the shape of, he would have had time to cover, to reframe, to get ahead of the story before I understood the full scope of what I was dealing with. I did not want an apology. I wanted the truth, all of it, and I wanted it while my son still believed he had gotten away with something. So instead, I called my attorney, a woman named Carol Ibsen, who had done my estate planning 11 years earlier and who I trusted the way you trust someone who has never once told you what you wanted to hear instead of what was true, and I asked her to meet me Saturday morning, at my house, not her office, because I did not want a single soul in that building to know anything was happening until I was ready. Carol arrived at 8 a.m. Saturday with a legal pad and, I noticed, her reading glasses already on, which told me she'd read every page of the folder I'd forwarded her the night before, twice, probably at her own kitchen table with her own cold coffee. We sat at my table for 4 hours. She asked me questions I had not thought to ask myself. Was there a shareholder agreement that defined what ownership transition would legally require? Yes, I had drafted one years earlier, with an entirely different lawyer, back when Bradley first joined the company, and I had structured it, out of an old habit born of watching too many small businesses get eaten alive by family sentiment, so that any transfer of controlling interest required a unanimous board vote, not a majority vote, and I still controlled 61% of the company outright. Bradley did not know that. I had told him, casually, years ago, that the structure would work itself out when the time came, because I did not think, at the time, that I would ever need to protect myself from my own son. Carol looked up from her legal pad at one point and said something I have not stopped thinking about since. She said, "Diane, at 30, a betrayal like this is usually about love, or the absence of it. At 60, and in a business like this, it's rarely about love at all. It's accounting." He did the math on what you were worth to him versus what you were in his way of becoming, and he made a decision. The question now isn't whether he loves you. It's what you're going to do with the fact that he made that decision anyway. I did not answer her right away. I looked out my kitchen window at the 11 acres I had bought with company profits 15 years ago, at the barn I'd converted into an overflow warehouse, at the mesquite tree Ray and I had planted the year before he died that was now taller than the house, and I thought about every callus, every missed school function because a shipment was late, every Christmas I worked half the day because a client in a different time zone had an emergency, every single thing I had built with hands that Bradley used to hold when he was small enough to believe his mother could fix anything. Then I said, we're not going to confront him. We're going to prepare. That decision, the decision not to react, not yet, not until I understood everything, is, I think, the hardest and most important thing I did in this entire story. I want to say something directly to you if you are watching this and you are in the middle of your own version of this discovery right now. The instinct to confront immediately, to demand an explanation while your hands are still shaking and your voice is still raw, feels like justice. It feels like the only honest thing to do. But it almost never is the thing that actually protects you. What protects you is knowing everything before you say anything. Over the following 10 days, I did 4 things. First, I asked Priya to quietly document every operational decision Bradley had made in the past 18 months that touched Holbrook Capital, cross-referenced against board minutes, so I would know exactly how many decisions had been made without proper authority. Second, I asked Carol to formally review our shareholder agreement and confirm, in writing, precisely what protections I had, not what I believed I had, but what a court would actually recognize. Third, I quietly reached out to 2 of our longest-standing manufacturing partners, men who had done business with me since Bradley was in elementary school, and asked them, without explaining why, whether they had been approached by anyone claiming to represent a new ownership direction at Whitfield Industrial. One of them, a man named Hector Alvarez who has known me for 26 years, went quiet on the phone for a second and then said, "Diane, I didn't know if I should say anything. Bradley called me about 6 weeks ago. Said things were changing at the top. Asked if I'd be comfortable renegotiating our contract terms once the transition was complete." 6 weeks. My son had been telling our own manufacturing partners that ownership was changing before he had told me anything at all. Fourth, and this is the part where I want to be very honest with you, because it was the hardest of the 4, I kept showing up. Every single day, for those 10 days, I went into the office. I sat in my usual chair at Monday's leadership meeting. I asked ordinary questions about ordinary things. I ate lunch, twice, across the break room table from my own son, and I asked him how his weekend was, and I listened to him answer, knowing what I now knew, and I did not let one flicker of it show on my face. I will tell you honestly that this was the hardest part of the entire ordeal, harder even than what came at the end. There is a very specific kind of exhaustion that comes from performing normalcy while carrying the full weight of betrayal underneath it. I would come home each of those nights and sit in my truck in my own driveway for 10, sometimes 15 minutes before going inside, not doing anything, just sitting, because I needed a few minutes where I did not have to hold my face in a particular shape for anyone. One of those nights, the Wednesday before everything came to a head, I sat in that truck and let myself feel, for the first time since reading that memo, something other than the cold, steady resolve that had been carrying me. I let myself grieve, a little, for the boy who used to run to the end of the driveway when he heard my truck coming home, before he was old enough to be embarrassed by it. I want you to understand that even at the end of this story, even after everything, that particular grief never fully left. You can protect yourself completely and still miss who someone used to be. Both things are allowed to be true at the same time. I want to tell you about 2 more moments from that 10-day stretch, because I think they show something about what it actually costs to hold that kind of composure, and I don't want to make it sound easier than it was. The first happened on a Friday, 4 days into the preparation, when Bradley stopped by my office unannounced, something he almost never did, since his office was on the other side of the building, and sat down across from my desk with a coffee for each of us, the way he used to when he was first learning the business and wanted advice. He told me, that afternoon, that he'd been thinking a lot lately about legacy, and that he hoped, someday, the company would carry both our names on the building, not just mine. I remember holding my coffee cup very still, because my hands wanted to shake and I would not let them. I told him that sounded like a lovely thought, and I asked him how the Tucson negotiation was progressing, the same negotiation where he had told me, in front of 11 people, that I was too old to understand what was happening, and I watched him answer smoothly, easily, without a flicker of hesitation, describing a version of events that left out 14 months of private conversations with a firm that had already priced my ceremonial exit into their planning documents. I smiled. I thanked him for the coffee. He left my office believing nothing had changed between us. I sat there afterward for a long time before I could make myself pick up the phone and call Priya for our scheduled check-in. The second moment happened that same Friday evening, at a family dinner I could not get out of without raising suspicion. Ashley had organized it, a small gathering to celebrate her sister's engagement, nothing to do with the company at all. I sat at that table, ate grilled chicken and a dinner roll, and listened to Bradley tell a funny story about a fishing trip from years ago, one I remembered clearly, one where he'd fallen out of the boat trying to reel in what turned out to be an old tire. I laughed, genuinely, at the right moment in the story, because it was genuinely funny, and because some part of me that had raised him for 34 years was still, underneath everything, capable of loving the boy in that story even while the folder from Priya sat, printed and highlighted, in a locked drawer of my desk at the office. I remember driving home from that dinner with the windows down, the desert air still warm even after dark, cicadas going in the mesquite trees along the road, and thinking that grief and resolve can occupy the exact same body at the exact same time without either one canceling the other out. I did not know that yet, not really, not with any depth, before that week. I know it completely now. By the following Tuesday, Carol had finished her formal review of the shareholder agreement, and she called me at 7:45 in the morning, before I'd even finished my coffee, to walk me through it line by line. She confirmed what I had believed but not verified, that the 2011 agreement, drafted by an attorney I'd hired specifically because he had a reputation for being paranoid on behalf of his clients, gave me sole authority, as majority shareholder, to remove any corporate officer for cause without requiring a unanimous board vote, so long as cause was documented and presented to the board for formal ratification within 30 days. 14 months of unauthorized negotiations with a third-party investment firm, disclosed to external manufacturing partners before being disclosed to the board or to me, satisfied the definition of cause several times over. I remember sitting at my kitchen table with the phone against my ear, looking out at the mesquite tree, and feeling, for the first time in 10 days, something that was not quite relief but was at least the shape relief eventually takes when it finally arrives. By the following Monday, I had everything I needed. The full record of Bradley's communications with Holbrook Capital. Confirmation from Hector and 2 other partners that Bradley had been quietly laying groundwork for a leadership transition without board authorization. Carol's formal legal opinion confirming that under our existing shareholder agreement, I retain not only majority ownership but sole authority, absent a unanimous board vote, to remove any officer of the company, including the president, for cause, with cause explicitly defined to include unauthorized negotiations affecting company ownership. I scheduled a board meeting for the following Monday morning. I told Bradley, when he asked what it was about, that it was a routine quarterly governance review. That was, I will admit, the one and only time in this entire story that I was not fully honest with him. I have thought about whether that makes me a hypocrite, given everything I've told you about honesty and trust. I don't think it does. I think there is a difference between deceiving someone to take something from them, and declining to warn someone before you finally show them what they've already taken from you. The morning of the meeting, I remember exactly what I wore, a navy blazer, the same one I'd had for 6 years, and a pair of reading glasses on a silver chain that had belonged to my mother, who cleaned houses for people who called her by her first name. I remember it was exactly 9:03 a.m. when I walked into that conference room, because I looked at the clock on the wall, a clock I had bought at a Home Depot in 2004, and thought, distinctly, that I wanted to remember this exact moment for the rest of my life. 11 people sat around that table. The full board, 5 members, including Bradley, myself, Priya, and 2 outside directors I had brought on years earlier specifically because they had no personal loyalty to either of us, only to the health of the company. Carol sat at the far end, her folder closed in front of her, waiting. Bradley sat in his usual chair, relaxed, one arm draped over the back of the seat beside him, exactly the posture of a man who believes the room already belongs to him. I want you to picture that posture, because I want you to understand how completely it changed over the next 40 minutes. I did not raise my voice. I opened with a single sentence, and I delivered it exactly the way I say ordinary things, because that flatness is precisely what made it land the way it did. Before we begin the quarterly review, I said, there's something every person in this room has a right to see. I nodded to Carol. She opened her folder and began distributing copies, not all 41 pages, just the 6 that mattered most, to every board member except Bradley, who received his last, on purpose, so he would have to watch everyone else's faces change before he had even opened his own copy. I watched him go through what I can only describe as 3 distinct stages, in real time, and I want to walk you through them, because I have read enough about human nature in these years running a business to recognize the pattern even as I lived inside it. First came denial. He looked up from the first page, and he said, and I remember this precisely, this is out of context. These were exploratory conversations, that's all. Every company has these conversations. I let that sit in the air for a moment before I responded. 14 months of exploratory conversations, conducted from your personal email, describing me as managed out of my own company, with no board authorization, disclosed to none of us, including 3 of our longest-standing manufacturing partners, who you told about an ownership transition before you told your own mother anything at all. I said it evenly. I said it the way I would read a weather report. I think that flatness frightened him more than anger would have. Second came the pivot. This is the stage where I watched 34 years of raising a smart, capable man collide with 34 years of raising a man who had never once, in his adult life, faced a consequence he could not talk his way around. He turned to the 2 outside directors, not to me, and said, I think we need to consider what's actually best for the long-term health of this company, and respectfully, I think that requires fresh leadership perspective that isn't emotionally entangled the way, and here he stopped himself, just for a half second, because even he heard how it sounded, saying, emotionally entangled, about his own mother, in front of the woman who had put him through college. He tried to finish the sentence anyway. The way founder-led companies sometimes get stuck. Third came what I can only call self-destruction, and it required nothing further from me at all. One of our outside directors, a retired manufacturing executive named Walter Griggs who had sat on our board for 6 years and had a grandson roughly Bradley's age, set down his copy of the memo, looked directly at Bradley, and said, quietly, son, you wrote that you'd manage her emotional attachment to the business without disrupting operations. She's sitting right there. I don't think you need any help from us understanding how that sounds out loud. Bradley had nothing left to pivot toward. He looked, for the first time since I had walked into that room, genuinely young, not the polished 34-year-old president in a tailored shirt, but something closer to the boy who used to run down the driveway. I want to tell you honestly that I felt something complicated in that moment, something that was not triumph, exactly. I felt the particular grief of watching someone you love be exactly who they've decided to become. Carol spoke next, and this is the part one had asked her, in advance, to handle, because I did not want the final word to come from a mother. I wanted it to come from someone with legal authority whose statement could not be dismissed as an emotional reaction. She stated, plainly, that under the existing shareholder agreement, I retained sole authority to remove an officer for cause, that cause had been clearly established and documented, and that the board's role today was not to debate whether cause existed, but to formally acknowledge it for the record. I made a motion. Priya seconded it. The vote was 4 in favor, 1 abstention. Bradley did not vote against his own removal, which I think tells you something about how completely he understood, by that point, that there was no vote left to win. I did not gloat. I want to be very clear about that, because I think it is the single most important thing about how I handled that room. I did not raise my voice at any point in that meeting. I did not remind him of everything I had sacrificed. I did not list every lunch I missed and every Christmas I worked. I simply said, once the vote was recorded, Bradley, effective today, you're relieved of your role as president. Security will help you collect your personal items from your office this afternoon. I hope, when you're ready, we can talk, not as CEO and president, but as mother and son. But that conversation is going to have to wait until I'm ready for it, not until you're ready to apologize. He left the building at 11:40 that morning. I remember the time because I watched the clock again, the same Home Depot clock, and thought about how strange it was that a room could hold the entire collapse of someone's carefully built future in under 2 hours. I did not go home right away. I sat alone in that conference room after everyone else had filed out, the same room where, 3 weeks earlier, my son had told me I was too old to understand business. I sat in the quiet with the air conditioning humming and the chairs still slightly askew from where people had pushed back from the table, and I did not feel triumphant. I felt still. Emptied out, in a way I had not expected. I thought about Ray, and what he would have said, sitting across from me at that table. I think he would have been proud of me for not screaming. I also think he would have been the one, of the two of us, who cried first, and I let myself do a little of that, alone, in that room, before I gathered my folder and drove myself home. I want to tell you what happened in the weeks after, because I think the aftermath matters just as much as the confrontation itself, maybe more. Bradley did not speak to me for 11 days. I did not push. I sent one text, for days after the board meeting, that said simply, "The door is open when you are." I did not send anything else. I have learned, at 60, after 34 years of building something out of nothing, that the people who love you badly often need silence before they can find their way back to loving you correctly, if they ever do. On the 12th day, he called. I remember I was in the garden, of all places, pulling weeds from around the mesquite tree Ray and I had planted, when my phone rang. Bradley's voice, when I answered, sounded smaller than I had heard it in years. He did not open with an excuse. He said, "Mom, I don't fully understand yet how I got to a place where I could write that about you. I think I need some time to understand it before I ask you to forgive it." That was, I think, the most honest thing my son had said to me in over a year, and it was the beginning, only the beginning, not the resolution, of something real between us. I want to be honest with you about where things stand now, a year later, because I think you deserve the whole truth, not a tidy bow. The private equity deal collapsed within weeks. Once Holbrook Capital understood the ownership structure was not what Bradley had represented to them. Dennis Farrow called me directly, apologized for his firm's role in an irregular process, and, oddly enough, asked whether I would consider speaking with them again someday, on my own terms, when and if I ever decided growth capital made sense. I told him that was possible, someday, but that it would be a conversation I initiated, on a term sheet I understood completely, which I made a point of saying slowly, so he understood exactly what I meant by it. Bradley did not return to Whitfield Industrial Supply as president. He spent about 7 months doing something I think surprised both of us. He took a mid-level operations role at a competitor across the state, a much smaller company, reporting to someone else for the first time since college, learning what it actually feels like to be managed rather than to manage. Last I heard, from him directly, over dinner about 6 weeks ago, he's doing well there. Learning, he says, what it actually costs to build something instead of inheriting the finished version of it. Priya is still my CFO. I gave her a substantial raise and made her a company vice president, and I have never once regretted trusting her with the truth, even the parts of the truth that were hard for her to hand me. As for me, I still drive the same truck, though it's a newer model now. I still go into the office most mornings, though I've started taking Fridays off, which is new for me, and which I spend, more often than not, sitting on my back porch with a cup of coffee I actually finish while it's still hot, looking at that mesquite tree, which is taller than the house now, taller than I ever expected it to get. I still wear my mother's reading glasses on their silver chain. I still keep the folder, all 41 pages of it, in the bottom drawer of my desk, not because I need it anymore, but because I think it's important to remember, on the days when I start to doubt myself, exactly what I was capable of when it mattered. Here is what I think this whole thing was really about, underneath everything, the betrayal, the meeting, the vote, all of it. I don't think Bradley ever stopped loving me. I think he stopped believing that a 60-year-old woman with calluses from 34 years of loading pallets could still be the smartest person in the room. And I think that is a mistake an entire generation makes about the people who came before them, not out of cruelty, necessarily, but out of a kind of blindness that convinces the young that competence has an expiration date. Age does not erase what a person built. It is the proof of it. If you are watching this tonight because someone in your life, a son, a daughter, a business partner, a spouse, has decided, quietly or loudly, that you are too old, too slow, too out of touch to matter anymore, I want to say something directly to you. You are not the liability they've decided you are. You are the foundation they are standing on while they say it. If you are in the middle of discovering something right now, a folder you weren't meant to find, a conversation you weren't meant to overhear, a memo you weren't meant to read, please, do not confront it in the first white-hot hour. Gather everything first. Understand the full shape of what you're dealing with before you say a single word. That is not weakness. That is the same discipline that built whatever it is they are now trying to take from you. If you are an adult child watching a parent be taken advantage of, or if you have ever, in a moment of impatience or ambition, done something close to what my son did, I am not going to tell you that you are unforgivable. I am going to tell you that the path back starts with understanding exactly what it cost the person who loved you, without minimizing it, and without rushing them toward forgiveness on your own timeline. And if you are someone who has spent decades carrying the financial or emotional weight of a family, alone, quietly, the way I carried this company for 34 years, please hear me when I say this, you loved correctly. Whatever anyone else did with that love, however they mismanaged it or took it for granted or decided you were expendable because of it, that was their failure of character, not yours. You loved correctly. They acted incorrectly. Those are two completely different things, and I want you to let yourself believe that difference all the way down to the bottom of your chest. Here is one practical thing I would ask you to do this week, if any part of this story touched something real in your own life. If you own a business, a home, or any asset with a family member involved in its management, pull your governing documents. Your shareholder agreement, your operating agreement, your deed, whatever applies to you. Read it. Not the summary someone gave you years ago. The actual document. If anything in it surprises you, call an attorney before you say a word to anyone else about it. I promise you, it is a far better feeling to know your protections exist before you ever need them, than to discover them for the first time with your hands shaking at your own kitchen table. I'll leave you with the question I have been sitting with myself, in the year since that board meeting. Is there a room in your life right now where you have been making yourself smaller, quieter, more agreeable, so that someone else could feel bigger and more capable standing next to you? And if there is, how long, exactly, do you plan on staying in that room? I'd love to know where you're watching this from tonight, and what time it is where you are right now. Someone always seems to be watching these videos at 2 in the morning, from somewhere I would never expect, and somehow it's the exact story they needed to hear that night. That means something to me every single time I read these comments, and I do read every one of them. Drop a 1 in the comments if you believe Diane made the right decision not to confront Bradley the moment she found out. Drop a 2 if you think there's more emotional complexity here, if part of you understands how Bradley got to where he was, even if you don't excuse it. Drop a 3 if this story touched something real in your own life, a business, a family, a moment when someone decided you didn't matter as much as you actually did. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined in Prescott, Arizona, to create original content. Any resemblance to real people, locations, or events is entirely coincidental. If anything in this story matched your real life too closely, please reach out to a licensed attorney, a trusted financial advisor, or a counselor you trust. You are not alone. And remember, sometimes the truth does not arrive with a crash. Sometimes it is just a quiet sound you finally stopped ignoring. Pay attention. Stay kind. Stay awake.